Gunpowder smoke drifted over the charred nutmeg groves while Dutch soldiers tightened the cordon around the Banda villages. Under Jan-Pieter Zoon Cohen's command, armed men dragged trembling islanders into the main square, their wrists bound with rough rope. Muskets rested against shoulders, pikes glinted in the equatorial light. Survivors later recalled the confusion of shouted orders in Dutch and Malay, the thud of boots on packed earth, and the muffled sobs of families pressed together, waiting for judgment. Executions followed in grim succession. Men accused of resisting the Dutch East India Company were lined up and shot or beheaded, their bodies left as warnings. Troops moved through the orchards, cutting down laden nutmeg trees and setting huts ablaze, the resinous smoke mixing with the sea air. Company clerks stood nearby with ink-stained ledgers, noting which villages were emptied, which plots cleared, and how many survivors were marked for deportation or forced labour. Ships waited at anchor as groups of Bandanese were marched to the shore, herded onto vessels bound for distant plantations or slave markets. Company documents recorded the depopulation in stark numbers, alongside neat diagrams of how the confiscated land would be divided among incoming Dutch planters and their Asian allies. On maps in Batavia and Amsterdam, the Banda Islands appeared as small specks, yet annotations emphasized their immense value. The near-total source of the world's nutmeg and mace, now brought under lethal monopoly. Along the quays of Calicut, bundles of pepper and sacks of cloves passed from calloused hands to ink-stained ones, each transfer marked by weighed stones and scratched tallies. Ships from the Red Sea, Gujarat, and the Malay world lay at anchor, their holds already fragrant. Port officials moved between bales, counting, taxing, and negotiating exemptions, while scribes recorded origins, quantities, and promised returns in ledgers that linked distant ports into a single, pulsing circuit of exchange. In Malacca's sheltered harbour, junks from southern China rode at anchor beside slim Arab dhows and broad Indian cargo vessels. Warehouse doors stood open to the damp air, releasing the mingled scents of nutmeg, sandalwood, and camphor. Brokers argued beneath hanging scales, matching spices to bolts of silk and bars of silver. Rulers' emissaries watched the bustle, ensuring that customary tribute was paid, while envoys from inland polities bartered coastal access for cloth, beads, and worked metals. Far to the east, on the volcanic slopes of Ternate and neighbouring islands, nutmeg and clove trees grew in carefully tended groves, discreetly guarded by local communities. Seasonal winds dictated when visiting merchants could approach, and when they arrived, transactions unfolded under the gaze of armed retainers loyal to island sultans. Agreements rested on long-practiced obligations and rivalries as rulers balanced Arab, Indian, Javanese, and later Chinese interests, preserving both autonomy and profit in these densely contested spice frontiers. Ink lines on the parchment traced a narrow funnel where oceans, straits, and caravan paths converged into a few guarded choke points. Ships left the Maluku Islands and the pepper ports of India laden with bales and jars, then disappeared into the monsoon lanes of the Indian Ocean. In Aden and Jeddah, factors recorded each sack and bale, weighing and grading them before customs officials stepped in, measuring value in carefully tallied taxes and duties. Farther north, caravans pressed through desert heat toward Damascus and Cairo, their guards watching the horizons while scribes guarded ledgers. In Alexandria's warehouses, pepper from India and cloves from the Spice Islands mixed with silks and aromatics from farther east. Venetian agents haggled under vaulted ceilings, locking in advance purchases that fixed prices months ahead. Behind closed doors, they coordinated shipments and credit, building cartels that squeezed rival European buyers out of the most desirable lots. In palaces to the west, frustration hardened into strategy. Royal councils studied reports of Venetian profits and Mamluk and Ottoman tolls at every port and caravan stage. Advisors spread maps on tables and pointed toward the Atlantic, arguing that the cost of spices reflected not rarity alone, but layers of intermediaries. Letters spoke of draining wealth into the coffers of Muslim rulers and Italian merchants, and proposed that new sea routes might overturn this balance of power. Along the windswept shores of Sagres and Lagos, shipwrights hammered planks into sleek caravels, while pilots studied crude portolan charts spread across worn tables. Astrolabes, quadrants, and mariners' compasses lay beside sand-filled hourglasses, each instrument promising a small measure of certainty on an unknown sea. Crews drilled with lateen sails, learning how to tack into the wind, as captains traced imagined coasts of Africa with ink-stained fingers, planning cautious steps into the Atlantic swells. Reports from Bartolomeo Dias's storm-battered ships described a coast that finally curved east at the Cape of Good Hope, where roaring southern seas met the Indian Ocean. When Vasco da Gama later followed, his pilots watched the sky and sea for signs of the monsoon, trading information and interpreters along East African ports. Logbooks recorded strange currents, dead calms, and sudden squalls, each entry turning guesswork into a navigable pattern of winds that hinted at a direct sea road to India. When da Gama's fleet anchored off Calicut in 1498, holds slowly filled with sacks of pepper, bundles of cinnamon, and smaller parcels of cloves and nutmeg purchased in bustling markets. Months later, those same holds opened on the Tagus River, pouring fragrant cargo into Lisbon's warehouses. At the Casa da India, clerks inked figures showing profits multiplied dozens of times over. In Venice and Cairo, merchants and officials examined shrinking orders and uneasy balance sheets, sensing that the old overland spice artery had begun to wither. In the counting rooms of Castile, officials weighed ledger books against burlap sacks of cloves. The single surviving ship, Victoria, lay battered in harbour, its hull leaking resin-scented water, but its hold exhaled the dense perfume of Moluccan spice. Clerks scraped quills over parchment, converting each sack into columns of maravedis and ducats. The figures climbed with every tally. Even after losses in ships, men, and provisions, the cargo almost erased the expedition's crushing expense. Reports from survivors moved through court corridors, describing storms in the South Atlantic, hunger in the Pacific, and the killing of Ferdinand Magellan in the Philippines. Faces tightened as listeners heard of mutinies, executions, and scurvy-ravaged crews. Yet when treasurers opened the manifests, the language shifted to weights, prices, and monopolies. Cloves from Ternate, compressed into bales, were entered at European market rates. The numbers turned disaster into profit in lines of ink that ignored dead sailors' names. Advisors unfolded maps beside the balance sheets, tracing a thin line from Seville past the Strait of Magellan to the Maluku Islands and back around the Cape of Good Hope. Their fingers paused over the archipelago where cloves and nutmeg grew on a handful of volcanic slopes. To them, these trees justified armadas and treaties, sieges and massacres. One cargo had nearly paid for years of hardship at sea, and in the quiet rustle of paper, the case for further imperial ventures hardened. In the crowded counting houses of Amsterdam and London, rows of ledgers lay open as clerks recorded subscriptions to new joint stock ventures. The Dutch East India Company received its charter in 1602, the English East India Company 2 years earlier, both granted authority to make war, conclude treaties, and build fortified posts. Shopkeepers, artisans, and wealthy merchants purchased shares, their money drawn toward rumours of cloves, nutmeg, and pepper worth many times their weight in Europe. Original charters outlined monopolies, legal immunities, and generous dividend promises based on distant cargoes yet to sail. Lists of shareholders filled with names previously absent from high commerce showed how risk and reward spread beyond royal courts. Company directors studied maps and sea logs, plotting routes toward the Moluccas and Malabar. In meeting rooms thick with pipe smoke, they calculated profits from each sack of spice, then ordered fleets armed with cannon to defend those projections. Far from these boardrooms, hulls crashed together in narrow straits near Ambon as broadsides shattered masts and rigging. Dutch and English squadrons hunted Portuguese carracks, while Portuguese garrisons at Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz faced bombardment and siege until key fortresses fell or changed hands. Captured sailors and merchants endured interrogations that turned quickly to torture when smuggling or espionage was alleged. Diplomatic protests followed, but broken bodies and executed prisoners marked how commerce had merged with war. On the Banda Islands, ledgers lay open with numbered rows of nutmeg trees, each column tying a living trunk to a fixed quota. Inspectors walked the Perkin, counting branches, estimating yields, and translating shade and soil into precise annual deliveries. Every planter signed to deliver so many pounds per tree, no matter the storms or blight. Shortfalls were treated not as misfortune but as defiance, recorded in ink alongside threats of seizure and exile. Smuggling a fistful of seeds carried the weight of treason. Patrols stopped canoes, searched baskets, and slit open mats, hunting for hidden nutmegs or seedlings. Confiscated spice was tallied in the same neat script as legal shipments, while punishments appeared in harsher words: whipping, imprisonment, banishment, execution. Testimonies spoke of families broken by accusations, of fields burned as warnings, and of a landscape where even fallen fruit on a forest floor felt watched. As Bandanese people were deported or killed, new labourers arrived in chains from other islands and from Africa, marched to the Perkin under guard. Dutch reports described them as assets, counted by age and strength, assigned to weed, graft and harvest under the glare of overseers. In distant chambers, the Treaty of Breda fixed this system in place. Run, dense with guarded nutmeg trees, was secured, while New Amsterdam, future New York, was calmly traded away as a lesser prize. In the northern Maluku Islands, Dutch officials ordered cloves uprooted and burned wherever they grew outside a few sanctioned islands. Smoke drifted over abandoned groves while scribes recorded each destroyed tree as a column in ledgers. Local rulers in Ternate and Tidor signed treaties under pressure, their own clove orchards cut back until tribute and access to Dutch warehouses became their main source of power. Ships loaded with carefully tallied bales sailed west, guarded by armed escorts. Across the Indian Ocean, French and British planners searched for ways to break this control. In the 1760s, the French botanist Pierre Poivre moved quietly through the archipelagos, examining nursery plots and bargaining for seeds beyond Dutch surveillance. Seedlings of clove and nutmeg were wrapped in damp moss, sealed in wooden cases, and carried aboard vessels bound for Isle de France, later known as Mauritius and Réunion. On these volcanic slopes, gardeners tested soils, shaded tender shoots, and recorded survival rates in neat, cramped script. Decades later in the Caribbean, surveyors paced out new plantation lines on Grenada and nearby islands, sketching rows of young nutmeg trees beside older sugar fields. Estate ledgers began to list nutmeg alongside cane and coffee as harvests of the pungent seeds and their crimson mace shifted profits and labour. In Europe, enclosed spice gardens in royal estates and botanical collections displayed thriving clove and nutmeg trees. Each successful transplant signaled another breach in former monopolies as living specimens became tools of strategy and calculation. On crowded European tables, the sharp scent of grated nutmeg rose from steaming jugs of wine and delicate custards, its pale dust vanishing into rich sauces. Cloves pierced roasting pork and game birds in precise patterns, releasing a sweet, medicinal heat that mingled with smoke and fat. In great houses, servants ground black pepper by the handful, finishing dishes with a dark, speckled sheen, while in cramped city kitchens, a single pinch stretched across several meals. In vellum-covered medical treatises, physicians listed nutmeg among the strongest protectors against corrupted air, recommending it sewn into pomanders and sprinkled into tonics during outbreaks of plague. Clerics preached that foul breath and bodily excess could be disciplined with cloves and other aromatics, folding moral judgment into prescriptions for physical well-being. Pepper appeared as a warming, invigorating substance, thought to stir sluggish humours, rekindle desire, and signal a household's ability to command distant climates. Far from European kitchens, these same aromas threaded through daily life in the islands of Southeast Asia. Nutmeg and cloves perfumed betel quids offered to guests, staining lips red as conversations unfolded in shaded courtyards. In temples, carefully arranged spice offerings smouldered beside oil lamps, their smoke mingling with chants. At royal courts, sacks of dried buds and wrinkled berries lay stacked alongside textiles and metals presented as tribute, dowry, and proof of enduring alliances rooted in land and lineage. Ledger lines on brittle paper showed the turning of an age more clearly than any battle report. Columns of prices for pepper, cloves and nutmeg slid downward through the early 1800s as British-controlled plantations in Ceylon, Penang and the Caribbean poured new harvests into global markets. Crates passed through ports, once dominated by the Dutch East India Company, now filled with cheaper spices grown under different flags, dissolving centuries-old monopolies into ordinary competition. In London, members of Parliament argued over tariffs and imperial priorities, their speeches recorded in dense transcripts that weighed nutmeg against sugar, cloves against coffee and tea. Similar debates echoed in The Hague, where ministers studied trade tables that no longer justified wars for a handful of islands. Shipping manifests listed cotton, coal and metals with increasing prominence as industrial raw materials eclipsed spices in both revenue and strategic importance across the expanding world economy. Far from these chambers, the Banda Islands lay quiet under tropical light, their infamous fortresses of Nassau and Belgica preserved as stone reminders of shattered trees and vanished monopolies. Across the world, New York surged upward in steel and glass, its rise traceable in part to a 17th-century treaty that exchanged a small nutmeg island for this deep-water harbour. In modern kitchens, neatly labelled jars of spices sat within easy reach, their familiar aroma resting on centuries of coerced labour, contested sea lanes, and wars once fought over taste.